guys!
Hi, and welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we'll be counting down the top 10 best games of 2021. For this list, we're looking at the best games that come out of the gaming world in the last year. Let us know in the comments what games you think are the best games that you've gamed in the year 2021. Number 10.
I played the original World Ends With You about 10 or so years back on the DS. It's a game that I've loved for years for its unique gameplay and likable characters. And because Square Enix is finally giving us a sequel we've wanted, I started the year off by finishing off the Switch port. And my god, there is no best way to experience this game. The DS version is still easily the best one, but as the years go on, it'll be harder and harder for people to go back to it. Not to mention, the very non-traditional control scheme is just not going to work for everyone. The iPhone and Switch versions look amazing, but they both drastically change the gameplay and remove the metaphor the gameplay was supposed to stand for. And let's not forget the controls for the Switch version are just awful if you're playing on the TV. There was also the anime that came out this year, but I have no idea if it was any good or not. I didn't watch it. But, I mean, if you want to experience the story, you can watch that. But if you want to play the game, an anime isn't exactly the best choice. Final Mix is the best option for playing this story, so it's just a shame it feels so lazy of a port. It doesn't feel like they put in any effort to rebalance the game around the gyro pointer controls on console, leading to an irritating experience. And while the New Day content is neat, it's not at all worth having to play the entire game to get to.
Number 10.
So friend Owen has been hounding me to play Hotline Miami 1 and 2 for years, and I only just now got around to it. And I understand why he wanted me to play them both so much. Hotline Miami is a great game with a very interesting concept for a story. Hotline Miami 2, on the other hand, raises the bar even further with a more complex plot that elevates the original in so many ways. The way the gameplay was evolved, foregoing the mass system of the first in favor of multiple playable characters, each with their own gimmicks, helps the game branch out and become more of its own thing. What I think really stuck with me about this duology is that the games are ultimately about the relationship between violence and people. Some romanticize it, others traumatized by it, some seek to avoid it, while others prefer to dive head first. Some people dream of what it can bring, while others justify it through their beliefs. Violence is a cycle that can only end itself by mutually assured destruction, and Hotline Miami is the kind of story that can only really convey such feelings as a video game. It also helps that this tale of ultra-violence and the effects it has on us as humans is backed by some of the sickest soundtracks I've ever heard in an indie game.
Number 10.
Hey, what do you know? Bowser's Fury is pretty good. If the re-release of Super Mario 3D World was $40, I'd say this nifty side game is easily worth the extra $20. While I don't think it's Game of the Year like a certain donkey said, I do think it's a lot of fun and is a great experiment in marrying traditional Mario-isms with traditional 3D Mario-isms.
Number 10.
Xenosaga Episode 3, also Sprach Zarathustra. The words that immediately come to mind when I think of it are beautiful, confusing, well-paced, and time-constrained. Some of my bigger issues with the first two games was how slowly paced they were. Sure, things happened, but it rarely felt like little of actual value ever really happened. Episode 3, on the other hand, feels incredibly well-paced. It never feels like the game is just sitting around twiddling its thumbs and waiting for something to come along and push the plot forward. And I'm sure the reason for this is because Episode 3 is actually 3 games in 1. While Xenogears had time constraints in the sense that they literally ran out of time to make the game, Zarathustra suffers from the fact that it had to end off what was supposed to be a 6-game arc with little hope of a continuation ever happening. In order to do this, the game introduces a Xenosaga Bible of sorts that helps keep the player informed. But this database becomes so overwhelming not even 5 hours into the game, and it only gets worse from there. The plot also ends up using it as a crutch, using it as an excuse to not have to explain certain things in the main story. As a result, I found myself utterly baffled a few times throughout the game, where the only remedy was to throw myself into a bunch of data logs that were frankly poor replacements for proper storytelling. When it came to the gameplay, Zarathustra is easily the best playing entry in the series. While I was initially disappointed that it abandoned the Xenogears combat system for a more traditional setup, I found this new system to be incredibly fun and cut down on repetition to some extent comparatively. Not to mention ES combat. Another major issue I had with the first two entries were how tacked on the mechs felt in the grand scheme of things. In Zarathustra, however, not only did the mechs feel important to the plot, but there were plenty of sections where you fight in them and their combat was incredibly fun. I'd love to play an entire game of just their gameplay, to be honest. But what I think I loved the most about the game was the moments of beauty it had to offer, especially towards the end. Moments of dramatic restraint met with an utterly divine score made for some of my favorite moments in all of Xeno. Not to mention the absolute GOAT that is Alan. Homeboy is quite literally one of the best characters Tetsuya Takahashi has ever thought up, and I love him more each and every day.
Number 10.
Strikers is the best Persona spinoff by a mile, if you ask me. Not only does it feel like a full adventure, but the game doesn't outstay its welcome. While not as good as either Hyrule Warriors, it's still a solid spin-off entry in the franchise. However, it's a unique situation where I think the only people who are really going to like this game are fans of Persona. When it comes to Musou crossover games, you can safely assume any crossover is at the very least going to appeal to fans of both Musou and the property it's crossing over with. One Piece, Berserk, Zelda, Fire Emblem that one time, etc. How good the game is will vary, again, Fire Emblem, but ultimately it'll still be something Musou fans can enjoy to some extent. With Persona 5 Strikers, I don't think that's the case. This is not a Musou game in the same way Hyrule Warriors is a Musou game. It doesn't combine elements of Persona and Musou to create a unique hybrid. Strikers is just a Persona game, but with Musou-styled combat. You spend most of your time running around dungeons, but the only fighting you do is when you encounter the enemy and start a fight. If you're good enough, you can just avoid fighting altogether as you run from point to point, only fighting when the game forces you to do so. If you are a Musou fan and the standard Persona gameplay structure isn't appealing to you, there's really nothing here for you. Otherwise, you spend your time like you do with any other Persona game, dipping in and out of dungeons, restocking odd items, health and MP, spending some time with your friends to up your bonds, etc, etc. But because Strikers only takes place over the course of a month, the calendar system is purely a narrative thing. In other words, it doesn't fucking exist. Time moves only when you progress in the story, meaning you can just mess around in the first dungeon for hours on end and never lose. It kinda makes having to leave the dungeon pointless. Time spent outside it doesn't actually mean anything, as there's nothing you can do but boring-ass side quests that ultimately just feel like filler. The only reason the game was balanced so you had to leave the dungeons is because that's a hallmark of modern Persona. The problem is that they got rid of the systems that made the time you spend outside of dungeons worth anything. Yeah, there are some things you can do to improve your bonds, but they're so basic and uninvolved compared to the mainline Persona games. As for the story, it's fine. It's nothing amazing, but it's not awful either. It's just an excuse to hang out with the P5 cast again, and in that respect, it serves its purpose. Sophia is an average character that recycles Aigis' plot with a bit of Morgana thrown in to spice things up, while Zenkichi is a really awesome character that sadly just recycles Dojima's story arc from Persona 4. In fact, this is probably the best time to bring this up. Persona 5 Strikers' plot is just a rehash of Persona 5's plot. I won't touch on it much here due to spoilers, but I will give an example. Take the first story arc in Strikers, the Shibuya jail led by one Miss Alice Hiragi. You can break the story structure down like this. Alice Hiragi is the monarch of a jail, a metaverse-based location that has become warped from the thoughts and actions of said monarch. Alice is an egotist who uses Emma to abuse, manipulate, and punish people, so she may either artificially achieve fame and or take revenge on those she believes to have wronged her. Alice also has a connection to An, based around the fact that An is a beautiful, popular fashion model. While she knows handing out her Emma keyword affects people, she is unaware of what is actually happening in the metaverse. Now compare this to Kamoshida and the first story arc in P5. Suguru Kamoshida is the ruler of a palace, a metaverse-based location that has been created from the thoughts and actions of its ruler. Kamoshida is an egotist who abuses, manipulates, and punishes people who question his authority, refuse his advances, or simply doesn't curtail to his desires. Kamoshida also has a connection to An, based around the fact that An is a beautiful, popular fashion model. His palace has no real-world effect, but Kamoshida is still completely unaware of what is happening on a metaverse level. They're not one-to-one, but you can see how the story arcs are pretty damn similar. And it doesn't stop there. Structurally, all but like 2 dungeons are almost copy-paste from some story arc in Persona 5. And again, Sophia and Zenkichi's story arcs are just recycled versions of Aigis and Dojima's arcs. It's not bad, but come on.
Number 10.
Bravely Default 2 is sadly the weakest Bravely Default game. Every entry in the series is not perfect. Bravely Default 1 shits itself in the build-up to the final act as it forgoes good game design in favor of solid story progression. Bravely 2nd avoids the gameplay issues of Bravely Default 1, while improving the combat further and even executing on the ideas that made the first game's story so incredible, better than the original. But it lacks some of the charm of the first game while also forcing you to watch that cursed shonen anime opening 8 goddamn times minimum. Bravely Default 2, however, feels like a step back in a number of ways. While the combat is incredibly smooth and still strategically satisfying, a lot of the quality of life mechanics that made the first game a keystone release for Square Enix's modern-day throwback games like Octopath Traveler are just missing. Toggles for experience, job points, and Pig, the ability to adjust the encounter rate, inability to fast travel into towns so you're forced to immediately enter a loading screen after you just went through a loading screen to get to this point, the inability to see buff and debuff duration until it's basically gone, and the 2 worst removals, the lack of an auto battle and the lack of dungeon maps. What's even more frustrating about the lack of dungeon maps is that they were in the demo they released to get feedback. When people complained about how awkward they were to use, their response was to remove them altogether instead of just fixing them. And then there's the story and characters, which is just a major step down on almost every level. Elvis and Adele are fine, but they pale in comparison to Adia and Ring-a-Bell. Gloria is boring, but so was Agnes, so it kind of balances out somewhat. However, Agnes was just so much better developed as a character. And Seth. I think I legitimately hate Seth. He quite literally doesn't serve a purpose in the plot. He's a silent protagonist in a game where he talks, but even then there are silent protagonists that are better characters than Seth. He has no stakes in anything. At no point past the first hour does he matter in the events of the game outside of he's the main character. His personality is cliched, that the only way I can describe him is pleasant and determined. And worst of all, he's just fucking boring. Tiz is a generic JRPG protagonist, but he's still a character I felt for because he mattered in the story. He had stakes in everything happening because it's directly responsible for the destruction of his village and the death of everyone in it. Then in Bravely Second, he's made into an even better character by making him the experienced warrior that mentors the new protagonist. Oh god, Yu Geniolja. Yu Geniolja is a fantastic character, easily the best protagonist in the franchise. He's flawed, but he's endearing. He's scared and nerdy, but you want to see him improve. He's tropey, but he's still incredibly memorable. one of my favorite protagonists in a modern RPG. Put him next to Seth over here, and he may as well be the greatest protagonist in any story ever. And this isn't even getting into the story. It takes 3 chapters to get interesting before it nosedives back into boring. Even the traditional plot subversions that made the stories of this series more than just generic Final Fantasy rehashes is done in an incredibly unexciting way. God, I don't hate this game. It's still good, but Christ almighty, it is the most disappointing game I've played this year.
Number 10.
This is the best Monster Hunter game. Outside of Generations, it's felt like every new Monster Hunter title since 4 has just been one-upping the last entry and claiming the title of best Monster Hunter game for me. Like Generations, Rise is another experimental title that introduces some unique ideas and mechanics, some of which I'm sure will return in future entries improved upon or integrated into other systems. The wire bugs are a ton of fun to mess around with, taking the idea of World's grappling hook and freeing it up so it becomes just a regular part of your moveset. Palamutes are a perfect addition that I'm confident will become a mainstay in the franchise. The only experimental feature in this game I really don't think will or care to see return are rampages. A tower defense mode is a neat idea, but outside of multiplayer, it's just tedious and boring. It's a nice novelty, but it's not something I'm exactly jumping at the bit to see more of. The post-launch support has been lacking, but overall, I found the base game of Rise to be filled with tons more content than World had at launch. Super excited to get back to this game when Sunbreak releases.
Number 10.
The original Nier, Replicant, and Gestalt are fantastic experiences that suffer from poor game design and a severe lack of budget. While Nier Replicant version 1.22474487139 ... doesn't fix every issue with the original game, it is, however, the best version one could play. Not only does it include all the content from the original, but the new additions fit seamlessly and add to the experience. The redone combat also helps make the game more fun to play, and Ending E is just a perfect epilogue to the plot that also acts as a great tonal transition if you were to play Automata right afterwards. While I prefer the story of Automata, the characters of Replicant are some of the greatest in any JRPG. All of this comes together to create one of the best examples of auteur theory in video games. I really don't know what else to say. Yoko Taro deserves any and all praise given to him.
Number 10.
World's End Club is pleasant. It's not a game I can recommend to people looking for the next big Danganronpa or Zeroscape type game, but for what it is, it's a lot of fun. The story is nothing amazing, nor are the characters particularly deep, but the overall tone of it feels more like Uchikoshi and Kodaka wanted to just have fun and unwind. The only drawback is the gameplay. While it can be fun and inventive, it never evolves upon any of its mechanics. Most of them are introduced and then abandoned until the very end of the game where they're used in the exact same way. It can be a little boring at times, but the rest of it makes up for it. The characters are all well written and the voice acting is actually pretty good. I appreciate the fact that they use non-union Texas-based voice actors as it helps give the game more of a vocal identity. Sometimes you just get tired of the same old LA actors and everything.
Number 10.
The Silver Case is such an interesting game. Out of all of the visual novels I've played, it's the one that's easily the most visual novel in its gameplay. You move around areas, but you're just moving from point to point to point, and any puzzles can be skipped. Some I skipped without even realizing it was supposed to be a puzzle. However, none of this really matters because the Silver Case is way more about the story than anything else. Every moment feels so much more interesting purely due to the dynamic presentation of everything. The characters are so fascinating. Tokyo Morishima and Tetsugoro Kusabi easily rank up there as some of the best characters Suda has ever made. Going back to the presentation, it's just incredible. Every moment feels so much more interesting simply due to how they present it all. It helps with the story because everything just has this dreamlike vibe to it, especially in the transmission chapters. I feel like I can never trust what is being presented to me, and because of it, so many moments just stick out in my mind. This game's plot is utterly fascinating and is probably my favorite story out of Suda 51. The themes and ideas it tackles left such a huge impression on me that I'm still thinking about it long after beating it. I truly think this is the best visual novel for people who don't like visual novels. It feels less like a game than Ace Attorney, Danganronpa, or Zero Escape, but it's way more engaging than every other visual novel I've attempted to play.
Number 10.
And now for the follow-up to the first game I played this year. Neo: The World Ends With You is a fantastic game that I'm so happy got made. Combat is tons of fun, retaining the sense of passing the puck between each party member while also having good controls for once. The music is god tier amazing, and it is easily my favorite soundtrack of 2021. Every track is a banger, and I find myself listening to all of it while on my way to work. The graphics aren't amazing, but stylized well enough that things such as low poly NPCs aren't distracting. One of the bigger improvements for me is that you're actually allowed to solve missions as opposed to the story solving it for you. When I was replaying the first entry, it honestly felt like I was just following the motions rather than getting immersed and involved. Sadly, as Neo goes on, there do come times where it just solves a mystery for you, but I'm glad it had the decency to just let me be most of the time. The characters are very well written, feeling down to earth and real in spite of some, like Nagi, very obviously being characters. However, I will say the only new character I came to love was Shoka. The rest I really liked, but never loved. And I think that kinda ties into the little gripes I have with the story. Both the original and Neo tackle similar themes, that your world is only going to be as big as you allow it to be, and that connecting with people is a difficult but necessary process. In the first game, those themes were woven into practically every aspect of the story and even its gameplay. Neo still tackles these themes, but it's not really until the end of the experience. The themes in this series are a large reason why I adore its characters, so seeing it wait so long kinda took the wind out of its sails somewhat. Overall, I think this is easily the better game, as well as having the better plot, but I think the first handled its themes better.
Number 10.
The 25th Ward is a worthy follow-up to the Silver Case, but it just didn't hit in the same ways the original did. The story is infinitely more surreal and avant-garde than the first, to a point that I struggled to really become attached to any character that wasn't returning from the first game. The themes of dehumanization and the digitization of society are at the forefront, and many of the characters simply act as vehicles for these ideas to be explored. That isn't to say the plot and said themes aren't immensely engrossing, however. The story is filled with interesting scenarios that, while confusing, play out in a very entertaining way with a lot of memorable moments. But sadly, I found that the more I played, the more tired I became. I'm totally cool with weird, dream-like stories with atypical writing, but I really felt like this game was pushing it at times. Despite all this, I would easily recommend this game to those who play the Silver Case, though I don't think it's something they necessarily like in the same way.
Number 10.
Killer 7 is easily Suda's magnum opus. I've never played a game like this, nor with a story that tackles these subjects. The gameplay is incredibly unique and surprisingly addicting the more you play. I thought it was just going to be some weird on-rail shooter type thing, but it ended up being so much more. In terms of the story, the conflict between East and West, human trafficking, the role and power of the media, it's just so grand, and it's easily the most grand of Suda 51's library. No More Heroes still holds a special place in my heart, but Killer 7 is absolutely Suda's best work.
Number 10.
Okay, if you couldn't tell, the reason I played so many Suda 51 games this year is because I was preparing for the release of No More Heroes 3. I did a Is a Good game on it, but having finished and sat on it for a bit, I feel like this game both satisfied and disappointed. I was excited as hell, but I did try to keep myself from expecting the world of it. In terms of story, I found a lot of it to be fun, but it just never met its full potential. All the returning characters, sans Travis and Henry, feel wasted, but I actually really like the new ones, even if some just kinda came and went. Fu is a fantastic villain and is easily one of Suda's best, second only to Kamui in my opinion. In terms of gameplay, the combat is the best it's ever been, and the minigames are actually quite fun, but the open world is just awful. Runs like garbage, there's little to actually do, and it feels like it's there more for fan service. Maybe I got my expectations up too much, maybe I didn't, but as it stands, No More Heroes 3 is the most incomplete entry in the series, despite being my third favorite. I'm still very excited for what comes next from Grasshopper, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a bit disappointed. Just give me that Notorious game and I'll be good.
Number 10.
I got a review code for this game and I still forgot it came out. A good game, awful port. I really can't say anything more than that. It's been talked to death and I just want to move on to Sonic Frontiers, which is written by Ian freaking Flynn, baby. Oh man, the comics are some of the best stuff to ever come out of Sonic.
Number 10.
You know what WarioWare Get It Together is? The best one. It's not a traditional WarioWare game like Twisted or Smooth Moves, but it's the closest we've gotten that's actually brand new in over a decade, and it's damn good. Playing as different characters with unique moves is great, though some are objectively better than others, and some are literally just better versions of another character. While I was hoping we'd get a WarioWare that took advantage of the Joy-Cons in the same way Smooth Moves did for the Wiimote, this is certainly a fantastic game, if only for Penny's theme alone.
Number 10.
So Deltarune Chapter 2 just kinda dropped out of nowhere, despite the fact they made it pretty obvious it was coming. Chapter 2 on the whole just further improves upon Chapter 1. Combat is refined, music is still top tier, the script is hilarious and touching, it's longer than Chapter 1, and it even offers multiple paths, which is a little strange when you consider Chapter 1 made a huge point about your choices not mattering. I'm wondering what Toby's gonna be doing with that. Regardless, Deltarune continues to be an excellent game, and I'm hoping we don't have to wait as long for the next batch of chapters. At least it gives me time to do the Snowgrave run, because unlike most fans, I'm a curious SOB who thinks what Toby Fox has done is super cool, and I want to see all the possibilities, even if it means I'm the exact person Toby is writing about.
Number 10.
Holy crap, I can't believe I almost forgot to include Astro's Playroom. This game is amazing. If you have a PS5, there is zero excuse for you to not play it. It's the best tech demo I've ever seen, and it's utterly packed to the brim with content. Fantastic introduction to the system.
Number 10.
I can't believe I'm saying this, but Resident Evil 8 actually got me to care about Ethan Winters. I love Resident Evil 7, but the one thing I came out of that game not liking was Ethan and Mia Winters. Ethan to me was the most boring Resident Evil protagonist. I love the idea of a normal dude being thrown into a Resident Evil scenario, but he was just so bland and uninteresting for me to actually care. Meanwhile, Mia partook in the messed up experiments that caused the events of RE7 to happen with little to no remorse until it backfired, yet she's never held responsible. RE8 not only handled these characters in the best way possible by 1, making me like and care about Ethan, and 2, removing Mia from the game as quickly as possible, but it also continues the trend of the first-person RE games by having a genuinely great plot twist I didn't see coming. While I personally think the series should continue in the style of the RE2 remake, I have to say I adore how much you can do in RE8. Not only is the main story lengthy, but there's so many side quests to complete and secrets to find. This isn't a game you can say you aren't getting your $60 out of. Combat is still amazingly tense and fun, puzzles are legitimately challenging, and the scares are so well paced and consistent throughout. Resident Evil games have always had this issue of the first area being the best one, but for the first time, I think every area in this game is truly great. House Beneviento is absolutely my favorite. It's literally the scariest thing I've played since PT almost 8 years ago. Jesus Christ, PT was almost 8 years ago. Oh god, I got out of college almost 4 years ago. Help me.
Number 10.
I've played almost every major Metroid game in some form. I still need to play a version of the first Metroid, which will most definitely be Zero Mission, as well as Prime 3 Corruption. While Metroidvanias are my favorite type of 2D game, I always preferred the Castlevania side of things. I'm not a diehard fan of Metroid, but I still love it. The reason I'm telling you all of this is so I can lay some background knowledge for when I say that Metroid Dread is not only my game of the year, not only is it my new favorite game in the series, but I also think it's straight up the best game in the series, period, rivaled only by Prime 1. There is nothing I can say that hasn't already been said. This game is incredible. My top 3 Metroidvanias have been updated. Number 3, Metroid Dread. Number 2, Aria of Sorrow. Number 1, Hollow Knight.
Number 10.
Lost Judgment is a solid sequel to the first game, but I feel like it doesn't do much more than that. The school stories offer a ton of new minigames, such as skateboarding, boxing, and Yagami doing a Fortnite dance, but it also offers probably one of the worst minigames in the series. Not to mention the fact that a lot of these minigames feel fairly bare bones. Combat is much better balanced than the first game, making Crane style much more usable, as well as adding in Snake style, which is my new personal favorite. However, it also introduces the problem of using one button to switch between upwards of 4 styles, something the series has avoided up to this point. The maps are also uneven in terms of content. All of the new and fleshed out minigames are all located in Ijincho, leaving nothing more than the arcades to Kamurocho. And you can still find all the same arcade games in Ijincho. Like with Yakuza 7, the game mostly takes place in Yokohama, but at least in that game, you didn't go back to Kamurocho until the very end. Not to mention, the skateboard feels useless in over half of it with how busy and narrow the streets are. The best part of the game is easily the story, but even that suffers from issues. Kuwana is one of the best characters to ever be introduced into this world, and he's easily up there with Goda as the best antagonist the series have to offer. He acts as a perfect rival for Yagami. Whenever the game is focusing on him and the subject of bullying, it draws me in and is genuinely amazing. But whenever it focuses on the standard Yakuza grand government conspiracy stuff, it just loses me. If the game retained its focus on being a small-scale, personal story focusing on bullying and how Japanese society fails to protect the victims of it, it would rank up there with Yakuza 0, 2, and even the original Judgment in terms of story. But as it stands, it's a solid narrative that sadly becomes too big for it to handle. At least it offered the introduction of one of my new favorite characters.
Number 10.
Welp, here we are. The big one. I already did a review that I'm confident a lot of you have already seen, but if you haven't, I'll put it in the top right. It's been about a month and a half since the game released and I beat it, so I feel like I've had plenty of time to really sit and gestate on my feelings for the game. As it stands, my feelings haven't really changed. I've just gotten to a point where I can better explain why I feel everything I do about it, which, to be honest, isn't really needed because I feel like I explained my feelings well enough in my review. But I still got some comments from people who just seem incapable of understanding how I could possibly like the story, which isn't really surprising seeing as there's a vocal group of fans who hate it. Initially, I was going to talk about my feelings on the story here, but as I was writing it, I realized there's a lot more I'd like to say than I could reasonably put here. So instead, what I'm going to do is make a separate video talking about the story, what I like about it, what I don't like about it, how it compares to other S&T games, and what I think could be done to improve upon it. Literally just stopped working on this script for 30 minutes so I could go write the base for that one, so I promise I'm gonna do it. Make sure to hit the subscribe button if you aren't already so you can tune in for when that is out.
Number 10.
Okay, so I actually played the Spider-Man PS4 DLC just before playing Miles, and I'm actually just gonna combine them both here, because man, that DLC is average at best, boring at worst. It's more Spider-Man PS4, which is a great game, but it just feels like a worse version of it. The screwball missions wear out their welcome, the story isn't very interesting, and certain characters act like complete idiots and never really get called out on it. There are cool bits, like Miles constantly calling Peter to ask him about training, but it's ultimately a much more boring version of one of the best superhero games ever made. Spider-Man Miles Morales, on the other hand, is a great game. Initially, I was hesitant about it due to being a sequel churned out within 2 years simply so the PS5 could have a brand new Spider-Man game at launch, but the positive critical reception assuaged that fear. A little over a year after launch, I decided to play the game as the last game I would play in 2021. And you know what? It was a fantastic note to go out on. The best way to describe my feelings on this game is that if Spider-Man PS4 was a 10 on 10, this is an 8 out of 10. It smooths out a lot of the issues of the original game, refining the combat and tossing out those weird hacking puzzles. It's still amazingly fun to jump and swing around New York, and combat is still incredibly addicting. Ultimately, it is another Ubisoft-esque open world, where the map slowly fills up with objectives that feel more like a list of chores than genuine discoveries, but this is still the best version of that type of open world. Story-wise, it never hits the same emotional highs as the first game, but seeing as I think Spider-Man PS4 is the greatest Spider-Man story I've ever seen, as well as being the best story I've seen in a superhero game, that was always going to be an impossible task that I wasn't expecting to be outdone. And all this isn't to say Miles Morales doesn't hit any emotional highs. When I finished the game, I was left with a massive smile on my face and a perfect understanding of what Miles Morales represents within Insomniac's interpretation of New York. While Peter is all about the inner hero we all share, using your strengths to help make the world a better place, and for you to become a better person, Miles represents that sense of community and reliance on others. That you can't always do things yourself, and that it's okay to reach out for help. Of course, Miles still represents that sense of individuality and being yourself that he's used to represent in things like Spider-Verse, but I found this new take on him refreshing. The story does still have issues, however. Certain plot beats feel like they aren't given enough time to really be explored. I'm sure they intended for Miles' relationship with his uncle to be something they'll explore over the course of this game and the next, but it feels half-baked here. Finn is a character that I feel is fully explored, but I just never actually came to care about her. I never cared about my relationship with her, I cared about Miles' relationship to her. And to be fair, I did really like their sibling-esque relationship. Even if I found it weird that she's meant to be a 17-year-old girl version of Phineas Mason, whom in the comics is fucking old. There are some versions of him in the comics where he looks like a Stan Lee self-insert. I also despise the Danica that Miles listens to. I understand it's meant to be more positive and help differentiate Miles from Peter, but Danica only ever recounts the events that just happened with no interesting spin put on anything. It's boring. Not to mention, it results in Jameson going from Alex Jones, but with a heart, to full-blown Alex Jones caricature. What I loved about Jameson in the first game was that no matter what, he still ultimately cared about others and would have his moments of humanity. Now he's just full-blown conspiracy theorist who only ever cares about others when he can contort it into a conspiracy. Jameson can be human, but because Danica is the human one, he's not allowed to be. 2021 was the second in a string of weird years. I'm not going to tell you guys what you already know, but I really do hope that in spite of everything, the last year went well for you all. For me, I went through a lot. I changed jobs to something that's both more and less stressful. I frustratingly spent over $1,000 on my computer trying to repair different issues, and I almost went an entire month with 0 days off from work while also churning out a video. I love all the positive feedback from my output this year, but I feel awful after doing so much work in such little time. But I also had a lot of good happen. Like with every year, I met some awesome new people, I got to collab with so many of my friends, I got over 13,000 subscribers, I got a review code for one of my most anticipated games, and the videos I killed myself over all performed beyond my expectations. I do have plans for 2022, but I'm gonna try and avoid doing what I did these last 12 months. Honestly, I just want to say thank you. You guys have no idea how much all this means to me, and your support has given me the courage to try and push this further. I'm trying to find a way to make this whole YouTube thing work while not compromising on what I want to do creatively. I love Shin Megami Tensei, but I hope you all will understand that I don't want to make videos on it exclusively. There's so many subjects I'd love to talk about, though I'll always come back to Atlas. I'm just happy to have your support. Before I get into the outro, I want to thank the breasty Claire for doing the Watch Mojo parody narration. She's a friend I wanted to do a collab with this year, but it didn't turn out. So I'm glad I was able to do something with her. Check her out, she's a Twitch streamer who plays a lot of RPGs, links in the description. What was a notable game you played this last year? Let me know in the comments below, and hey, check out my other videos. If you liked what you saw here today, leave a like and subscribe for more. If you want to support the channel, you can pledge as little as $1 a month over on my Patreon, link in the description below. I'm gonna go watch Into the Spider-Verse again while I imagine how the plot of Miles Morales would have gone if the story and character relationships were the exact same, but the Tinkerer was comic accurate.